You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In recent years, we've made tremendous progress in recognizing the importance of sexual consent and promoting healthier communication about boundaries, desires, and expectations. But is consent enough on its own to tell us whether a sexual experience was ethical, healthy, or mutually fulfilling? Consent is often treated as the dividing line between right and wrong, but it's not as simple as that. People sometimes agree to sexual experiences they don't genuinely want. Desire and willingness don't always align. A verbal yes doesn't necessarily tell us everything we need to know about how someone is feeling or what they truly want. So how should we think about those situations? What are the limits of consent as a framework for understanding sexual ethics? And if consent is necessary but not always sufficient, what else should we be paying attention to? In this episode, we're diving into the ambiguity of consent. We're going to explore the difference between consent and desire, why affirmative consent frameworks sometimes fall short, and what it means to think more deeply about sexual ethics beyond simply obtaining agreement. My guest is Michelle Meek, an author, filmmaker, and professor who has published several books, including The Ambiguity of Consent, Consent Puzzles in Film, Television, Public Discourse, and the Law, as well as Consent Culture in Teen Films, Adolescent Sexuality in U.S. Movies. She is a tenured associate professor of communication at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around, and we're going to dive in right after the break. Ever wondered how sex differs around the world? Come study it with me. Join me and Sexual Health Alliance for an immersive study abroad experience where we explore sexuality, psychology, culture, and science firsthand. You'll learn from international experts, travel to incredible places, and connect with students from around the globe. Since 2015, Sexual Health Alliance has been at the forefront of sexuality education, and you can be part of it. Join me, Shaw, and a global community of students for a transformative study abroad adventure. Later this year, we're heading to Berlin and Copenhagen, both of which are beautiful cities to experience and full of incredible learning opportunities. Spots are limited, so head to sexualhealthalliance.com to learn more and reserve yours. Come explore the world and the science of sex with me. Hi, Michelle, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. I think actually the last time I saw you was in Amsterdam when I think you came and presented to some of my students about your work, which was a fun experience.
That was amazing. What a great group.
And what a great place to be in Amsterdam, of all places, learning about sex and culture.
Yes, very appropriate.
So you have a new book out titled The Ambiguity of Consent. And I think that's an interesting title because most of us like to think of consent as something that's pretty clear and straightforward, like you either consented to something or you didn't. But your book argues that consent is often much messier than that. So what do you mean by the ambiguity of consent? And why do you think our cultural conversations about consent often overlook that complexity?
Well, I want to be clear that I don't think non-consent is ambiguous. No means no, and that's kind of a hard stop. That should be clear. If someone says no, there's no consent. I think where the ambiguity comes in is with yes, because yes can mean yes, and it also could mean maybe, and it also could mean no, actually. And the reason that is the case is because we tend to, in our new affirmative consent framework, we think of consent as verbal, and we think of it also as implying an internal willingness. But the fact is that sometimes a verbal yes matches with an internal willingness, and other times it does not. And so that's one of the main reasons why yes sometimes means no.
Yeah, and I appreciate you explaining that in that way because it's so true that when you say yes to sex, that can mean a lot of different things. And I think it really gets at this idea that consent is a little bit more complex and messier than we would like to think that it is. And so that's what I really want to dive into in this episode. So one of the ideas that I found especially interesting is your proposal to move away from talking about the gray zone of consent to to instead thinking about a yellow proceed with caution zone. So, what exactly is the difference between those two frameworks, and how can we acknowledge ambiguity without either minimizing harm on the one hand or slipping into victim blaming on the other?
Right. I think that one of the reasons that many people are resistant to talk about the ambiguous aspects of consent is because we don't want to give clearance to people who are saying, well, I didn't know. It's so confusing. Who could understand consent, right? That's not the point here. Where we make a mistake sometimes is thinking that if we avoid that gray area or middle ambiguous area, that we're safe by thinking yes and no are the only
Mhm.
options. The problem is that actually, for those of us who have had experiences, we know actually that in practice consent is much more complicated. And so if we deny that experience, we're really not setting ourselves up to minimize harm. In fact, we're actually making it more of a problem, because if we assume that a yes always means yes and there couldn't be some coercion involved, we might actually give a pass in an area where we shouldn't be. So one of the reasons I've kind of remarked the gray area as a yellow proceed with caution zone is because gray sounds just muddled and not able to be sorted out. And even though there is some truth to that, I think really what we should be saying is that when the area is ambiguous, when there might be power differentials, when there could potentially be a difference between what someone is saying or doing and what they're thinking and feeling, or what is it that's brought them to this moment. They might be saying yes, but what came before this that
Mhm.
might change the meaning of that yes? All of those things really put us in a situation where it's more than a gray area in my mind. It's really a yellow proceed with caution zone. It's an area where we should be really imagining that someone might internally feel that they are not consenting, even as they are verbally consenting.
And that's true for both parties who are involved in the encounter, right? And it's sort of approaching it kind of like if you were rolling up to a stoplight. If it's yellow, that's different than if it's red or green, right? If it's red or green, you know what you're supposed to do. But if it's yellow, you have to, really be cognizant and pay attention and look around at the cues before you make your decision and figure out how you're going to behave or react in that situation.
Exactly.
So, affirmative consent policies are often summarized as yes means yes. And while that approach was designed to improve upon no means no, you argue that it still has some limitations. So, where do affirmative consent frameworks succeed and where do they fall short?
I think the idea behind yes means yes is good. I think that the reason why no means no wasn't enough was because no means no was emphasizing that someone had to articulate no in order to mean no, which left us with, does silence mean consent?
Mhm.
And we understand now that no, in fact, silence does not mean consent, right? So this framework that shifted us into yes means yes was a way of largely reclaiming female sexual agency, so that it wasn't just women and girls being gatekeepers. And I say this in this framework that's gendered because so much of the way the framework came about were gendered. Not to say that this isn't applicable for all people in different sexual situations, because it is. But the movement, yes means yes, really came from a female sexual empowerment. Like, women and girls should be able to know what they want, articulate it, and be able to claim a yes for those sexual experiences. The fundamental problem, however, with yes means yes, and the reason why I don't think it's sufficient are some of the reasons I've said, where the internal willingness could be potentially different than what someone is saying or doing. I also think that there is the assumption with yes means yes that someone knows what they want and someone is clearly able to articulate that without any constraints. And as we know, sex involves power dynamics too. And so it complicates things. And in order to really feel like both parties or whatever parties are coming into it and feeling that consent is valid, we need to contend with the fact that the yes means yes framework is just not really covering everything. Not to say that it should be thrown out, but we need to acknowledge this kind of messy middle.
So you've mentioned a couple of times how consent might not always line up with this internal willingness. And something we've mentioned before on this podcast a few times is that wanting sex and consenting to sex are two completely different things. Yes, they often overlap, but there are many cases where they don't align, right? So for example, somebody might consent to sex that they don't actually want, and somebody might want sex, but still not consent to it. So these things don't always go together. Now, what I wanted to ask was, just because there is a disconnect, does that necessarily mean that it's non-consensual or that this is not an ethical situation? Like, for example, if you think about a context where somebody's in a long-term relationship and they want to please their partner, so they agree to have sex with them, even though they don't really want to do it, right? That would be one case where consent doesn't really align with the internal willingness. But does that mean that it's non-consensual? How do we think about situations like this?
I mean, I think this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the messiness of this middle zone, right? Because I think it's one thing to call something assault. And I think when we talk about non-consensual sex, we often align it with assault, which makes sense. But when you're talking about that kind of situation where somebody is consenting to something and the other person really takes that at face value and they have an experience, then yeah, I mean, how can you say that was non-consensual? The person obtained the consent. That doesn't mean that the other person who, quote, consented, even though the internal willingness wasn't there, doesn't experience that as problematic. And I think we have to recognize that consensual sex can still be harmful. It can still do harm. And that's another area that I think we often kind of glide right past. There's this notion of, quote, bad sex. And just because legally it might be completely fine, that doesn't mean that it's not harmful in another way.
Yeah, I mean, in reading through your book, something I couldn't help but think about was how consensual sex and good sex aren't necessarily the same thing. A sexual encounter can be consensual, but it can still be disappointing, it can be selfish, manipulative, emotionally harmful, or completely disconnected, right? So if consent isn't the whole story, then what else matters? What do we owe each other as sexual partners beyond simply obtaining an agreement, right? Consent is kind of the bare minimum.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of talk about it in the book as like it's a best practice. It's a harm mitigation strategy. It's not a harm eradication strategy because that is much more complicated. And I think that ultimately communication is important. And I think that that's where yes means yes has really helped quite a lot because it has kind of normalized the communication of sexual desires, preferences, particularly in a moment of saying, like, this is what I'm comfortable with, this is what I'm not comfortable with. And we're even seeing that in movie representations, and so normalizing communication is great. More of that is awesome. I also think that really being more open and honest about all the complexities of sex. Like you might go into something not knowing what you want. Mm-hmm. And you might be discovering that as you're having the experience. You might think you want something and then you start doing it and realize, I don't actually want to keep doing this. And that can be really hard to communicate. And the more we acknowledge that these kinds of experiences actually occur, and we can visualize them and know about them and talk about them, I think it's going to make it easier for people to, in the moment, be able to communicate. Because the problem with consent, especially in sexual consent, is that it's not like let's sign this agreement and now we go, right? I mean, because it's an encounter that's evolving minute by minute, second by second, right? And you might be changing your mind as you go along. And so an enthusiastic yes at minute 1 really says nothing about minute 10 or minute 40, right? And that's where I think part of it is we have to acknowledge that consent is evolving and needs to be constantly communicated as much as possible and normalize that.
Hey, Sex and Psychology listener, looking for another sex ed podcast that you're going to love? Then I recommend one of my favorites, Sex Ed with DB. Sex Ed with DB is a podcast about the sex ed you need, but probably never got before. Host DB has a Master of Public Health from Columbia University with expertise in sexuality and sexual and reproductive health. So rest assured that the show aims to bring you responsible, science-based information. Sex Ed with DB just launched its 14th season, which is focused on pleasure, ranging from the importance of intimacy to what happens in your brain during an orgasm. Join DB as she interviews experts in sex ed, answers difficult anonymous listener questions, and so much more. Use the link in our episode description to find a great starter episode, Maintaining Long-Term Relationships and Keeping the Spark Alive with therapist Dr. Lex Brown James. Check out Sex Ed with DB. Yeah, and I think you're so right that consent is this fluid thing, right? You can agree to sex, you can be very enthusiastic and excited about it, and you can start having sex and maybe it feels great. But then if sex becomes painful, you might change your mind and decide, I don't want to do this anymore, right? So there can be all kinds of reasons why that yes might shift or change to a no. And so we have to be mindful of that, dynamic nature of consent that, as you mentioned, a yes at minute 1 isn't the same as implying that you're going to be yes at minute 10 or minute 40. Now, I think one of the challenges that arises and that emerges from all of this is that it isn't always obvious when things change. And it isn't always obvious when somebody consents to sex if that internal willingness is also present, because people aren't always saying exactly what they want or what they need. And sometimes their body language and other things might be pointing in different directions than what they're saying. So in situations where consent appears to be present, but there's this kind of level of uncertainty, what kinds of cues or considerations should ethical partners be paying attention to?
I think that one of the things that might be able to help a lot is to understand differences of power in relationships and be clear about those. Some people are better at reading body language and facial expressions than others. Some of us have been trained to kind of look for minute changes in facial expressions, and we might sense when someone is feeling uncomfortable, even as they're saying something that kind of suggests they're like, let's go for it. But I think that as a partner, if you're giving someone an out along the way, that's really important. I would say, especially for women, because I've just talked to so many women over the years of the research that I've done, and really almost every single woman has had an experience where they've consented to something because they were actually kind of afraid of extracting themselves from a situation. And I'm talking about heterosexual situations. But women in heterosexual situations have often ended up in what I would consider non-consensual sex because they were afraid they might be harmed worse than if they just went along with what was happening. And that's awful. Let's move past that moment. That feels to me like it's on heterosexual male partners to be more communicative and make sure that there's safe outs along the way, that their partners understand that they can change their mind, they can say no. And I also think that another factor that can play into this is level of experience, which isn't always talked about that much. But, someone who's having a first time experience at something is at a disadvantage if the other person has had a lot of experience or even more experience. And it's not just age, it's also knowledge and familiarity. Like I said, someone might say they want to do something, and then as they're doing it, realize, actually, I'm not sure I like this. another thing to be clear about is that just because someone doesn't like something doesn't mean that consent is revoked. That's the thing that's complicated too. Like you could not like something and be like, I'm willing still to do this, even though it's not my favorite. Or so, I think the whole complication of how we think and feel versus what we're saying and doing, the more we could kind of find alignment in those two things, the better. And there needs to be safety. There needs to be open communication. There needs to be an explicit acknowledgement of power differentials. That's a start. Maybe not the finishing line.
Yeah, I mean, it's something where there are no simple or easy answers or solutions. But I think establishing really good communication patterns before you have sex with somebody can go a long way toward helping with a lot of this, because many people will start having sex before they've ever established any kind of sexual communication, because so many people just find it hard to talk about sex. Like they find it easier to jump into bed than to actually communicate about their wants and needs and desires. And I think that's really one of the fundamental problems and issues here, is that we first need to start by normalizing sexual communication. And to the extent that we can do that, that's going to make it easier during the act itself to communicate these things, especially if consent or desire or something like that shifts along the way.
Right. And sex is a vulnerable act. And then the communication is also a vulnerable act. Mm-hmm. But that's where I think the importance of feeling more comfortable. And that comes from a change in our sexual scripts as a culture, where we start to normalize a lot of this. And I think that's what I do see has improved quite a lot in the last couple of decades. Where I think that we're falling into some traps is where we might just create this binary. And that is just a false binary, as so many binaries as we know are.
Mm-hmm. So something else that complicates discussions around consent is regret, right? Because people sometimes look back on an experience and then they feel very differently about it now than they did in the moment. And sometimes too, our perceptions of whether we consented to something can change based on other information that we might get from other people, whether that's, talking about a previous sexual experience with a therapist or with a friend. They might say, that actually sounds like it wasn't consensual, right? And so you've got these things like personal feelings of regret, but then also our own perceptions of our own consent can be shaped by the views of other people around us. And so I don't know what my question here other than to say that, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to all of this too, is that it's not just that consent in the moment, it's how we later perceive what we did in that moment.
No, you're so right. And there are a lot of theorists who, there are whole books written about how we define consent. That's how complicated it actually is. One of the aspects that complicates it is this temporal aspect, where how do I feel before? How do I feel after? How do I feel during? And the fact that it's changing second by second, that there's that joke from the Saturday Night Live sketch about like, can I now touch you here? Can I now touch you here? Can I now touch you here? But it sort of is true. Like, how would you ever completely be assured of 100% consent without doing that? And even then it's like there, that time base. But I think regret is not the same as non-consent, but regret certainly could indicate something. I love using movies as examples. And there's a great scene in Lady Bird where she, quote, loses her virginity. I put that in quotes because virginity is not really a factual thing, but she has intercourse for the first time. And she thinks he's also having sex for the first time. And afterward, he says that it wasn't his first time. And she's so thrown off. And you can see her like outrage and regret. And now she's not sure what to make of her experience, because it's like, wait, I initiated that. I wanted it, but it was under false pretenses. And now I'm upset that I did this. And so I love how those moments in movies really show us exactly how complicated simple experiences can actually be in practice.
That's a good point that you make about regret there, and how you can be consenting to something under one set of circumstances, but it's only what you knew at the time when you consented. And sometimes we don't have the full information or the full picture. And so we might later say, well, had I known all of this going in, then I would not have consented to it, right? So I think gets at a whole other issue, which is, can you ever fully know everything that you would want or need to know beforehand when you're going to consent to sex, right?
I'm going to say probably not.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Which calls into question even our ability to consent, right? Because it's like there's some things that are very obvious, knowing about someone's STD status or something like that. Obviously, that would be grossly unethical, possibly illegal not to disclose. But how many sexual partners has someone had? How do we feel about that disclosure or not? It's a very complicated terrain, and to minimize the complexities of that is really not doing us any good.
So we so often only talk about consent in the context of hookups or brand new relationships, but many sexual experiences take place in the context of long-term partnerships. So how do the ambiguities of consent change or look different when people have a longer history together? Does consent become easier over time, or is it still this kind of murky area?
Well, I think that certainly sexual preferences would tend to be more known between two partners who have been together over time. And that creates kind of a shortcut. I think there's also the possibility, though, of a lot of complexities. Like, what if partners have been doing something one way, and then there's the assumption that it will always happen this way, and someone decides, I actually don't want to do it that way anymore. Like, again, it's about normalizing that communication. Just because two people are in a long-term relationship doesn't mean that there doesn't need to still be open and honest conversations on a regular basis about, like, what are we up for today? And what someone was up for yesterday doesn't mean that they're up for that same thing today or tomorrow. One of the things that's so important is that there are now marital rape laws, right? Years ago, it wasn't even possible to say that your partner or your spouse had assaulted you if you were married. And that makes no sense, obviously. So there could be more shortcuts, but certainly it doesn't mean that some of this ambiguous area couldn't still exist, because certainly it could.
Yeah. And I've seen it happen a lot where people in long-term relationships fall into patterns where it's like you said, sex kind of always happens this one specific way, and then it's not working anymore for one of the partners. And if that partner has people-pleasing tendencies or doesn't feel like they have the ability to say what they really want, or maybe there's even some fear or concern or anxiety layering on top of all of that, like, you can fall into this pattern where suddenly you're in this long-term relationship, but you're not really having consensual sex anymore. So it's a situation where we need to be thinking about consent, not just in the context of hookups, but in any type of sexual relationship that we might be having. So what do you hope people take away from this conversation, Michelle? I mean, obviously, what we don't want people to think is that, well, why even bother with consent? Because you can never know it for sure, right? That's not the conclusion we want. So what do you want people to take away from all this?
I think the main thing that I want people to understand about consent is that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in the last couple of decades in just making it more explicit that consent is important. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that consent really is a harm mitigation strategy, a best practices, so to speak. It's not an entire ethical framework that gets you off the hook for any act once you've obtained a yes. There still has to be open and continual communication and an awareness of these different factors. Like I said, power differentials in particular, knowledge, experience, age, ability, gender. That's really what I would like people to take away from it, that it's worth salvaging the consent framework. I'm not trying to throw the whole thing out, but I do want to acknowledge, and I want others to start acknowledging safely, that there is an ambiguous zone here that we need to contend with. As I said, the yellow proceed with caution zone. That means that we can look at this terrain and not be giving clearance to sexual assaulters, at the same time acknowledging that this is a lot more complicated than we sometimes like to discuss.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Michelle. I'm really looking forward to continuing it in the next episode and talking all about consent depictions in popular media. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Absolutely. You can reach me on my website, which is michellemeek.com. Michelle is with one L. You can contact me there, find access to all of my books and films and other work on my website.
And your latest book is called The Ambiguity of Consent. And I'll be sure to include links to everything in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.